Welcome to Science-Based Choices for Climate Action. We're here for a panel session on just transitions. As a prelude to that, I'll just welcome both our in-person audience and our virtual audience. Our in-person audience is thinning out. I don't think that's a reflection of lack of interest in the topic of justice and just transitions. I think we may have just kind of reached a point where some folks who've been here have departed. There'll be an opportunity to ask some questions here after our panelists make some remarks initially, so be prepared to ask some questions. We'll take questions from the audience that's here in the room with us, as well as from the virtual audience. I think I'll just leave it at that for the intro bit. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, I kind of threw a curveball at them. I put them on the spot here at the last moment here. So rather than doing a normal formal introduction of each, I'm asking them to each introduce themselves. And so do give us your name, your institutional affiliation, but I've also asked them to maybe share a little something about themselves that might tell us something about their connection to the work that they're doing now, the route they took to that work, whatever it might be, something that might not be the traditional biography. I gave Ben the most advanced notice on this, so maybe let him go first on that, and then we'll hear from our other two panelists.
This is the downside for showing up for things in person, I see. Thanks, Neil. So, hi everyone, good afternoon. We don't have an equitable distribution in the room. I see people are avoiding the middle, but
that's like our politics today.
Yeah, that's interesting metaphor. Yeah. So Ben Preston, senior policy researcher with the RAND Corporation, and excited to be here talking about this topic with all of you today. I mean, I think my entry point into this realm kind of came as a graduate student. So I was a graduate student at Georgia Tech. I was moonlighting. I was studying environmental toxicology and had an opportunity to sort of moonlight part-time with the Centers for Disease Control, where I was working in the Office of Urban Affairs. And the Office of Urban Affairs for CDC at the time was largely associated with environmental justice issues in urban communities, and particularly how to resolve issues around inequities and exposure to different types of environmental hazards, Superfund sites, fence line communities, et cetera. So that was actually my first exposure, really, to sort of the concepts of environmental justice and the concerns around environmental justice, and that was obviously looking at it in the American context. And I kind of left the toxicology realm, got involved in climate, and was involved in the climate arena for quite some time. And interestingly, at least in the context I was operating in, these sort of issues of justice and equity weren't featuring very prominently in the work that I was doing or what I was hearing about climate change for quite some time. And I think what we've seen over the past several years is this as sort of, the climate community is caught up with the broader environmental justice movement, and this has really taken off. So now, and I think appropriately so, much of what we see being discussed around the climate change challenge are really issues of equity and justice and environmental justice. And so in some ways, being able to sit here on this panel is for me a return to sort of my early introduction to this topic 25 or so years ago. So happy to be here.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Lisa, you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Lisa Schipper, and I'm sitting in an Airbnb in Bologna in Italy because my daughter is on holiday this week, so we're traveling. And she's sleeping just a few meters away. I am sort of in between. I'm going away from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, where I've been for the last 4.5 years, and I'm shifting over to the University of Bonn, where I'm going to start working next year in the geography department as professor in development geography. And I guess I got into thinking about justice issues. I think probably it started with my undergraduate first semester in environmental science, where I think the lectures that struck me the most were the ones where we talked about sort of the racial injustices around environmental issues. And also the way I remember very clearly, we talked about these boats that were full of waste that were traveling around the world, and how this really, really impacted me. But I think apart from that, I'm also very much a feminist, which is sort of part of obviously the justice lens. How do we look at these different gender dimensions? I'm also very, very concerned about the sidelining of qualitative social sciences and climate research. And therefore, I think that is a justice dimension, the knowledge dimension. But also part of the knowledge dimension is in my role as editor of Climate and Development Journal, what I've seen over the past decade in terms of how inequitably how unevenly knowledge tends to be distributed around the world, and what kind of knowledge gets profiled and what kind of knowledge gets pulled kind of into the policy process. So even what we have in the IPCC reports, although it's gotten much better. So I guess there's kind of three dimensions for me here.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Fatima?
Thanks, Neil, and hi, everyone. So yes, I guess it goes back to my professional life. And when I started, I was working at an NGO called Ende Tiers-Monde, that's based in Dakar. And it was headed at the time by Yuba Sokona. So I came in very much with a political science degree, a PhD. And, you know, I saw everything through that lens of political science, I think. And he basically said to me, listen, our problems are not political science related, they're development problems. So you need to start looking at things through that development lens. And I guess at the time, you know, we were talking a lot about CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. And basically, we were of the view that Africa wasn't getting a fair share of CDM projects. So a lot of the justice aspect, equity aspect came from that start. And I was also looking at the issues around energy poverty, around gender and justice, and the very fact that women are often get a raw deal, I think, especially in the development world. And, you know, they very active in the natural resource management world, but you know, we see a lot of strategies that that men use to muscle in on projects that are women-only projects. You know, so I think a lot of that came from those beginnings. I guess I would go to villages and ask people, why is it that you are allowing your husband or your brother or whatever to sort of take over? And they would say, well, we're the same family. So that's where it started. And I guess it grew. Recently, I've been doing quite a lot of work in my institute on stranded assets and trying to understand what that means for countries in Africa. And I saw so many layers of justice in the stranded asset conversation, and how, you know, countries in Africa would definitely need to rethink, you know, what net zero means to them and what transition means. So yeah, I guess that's where it all started.
All right. So it occurred to me after Ben started that I didn't introduce myself, and maybe I need to do the same thing that I put them on the spot for. So I'm Neil Leary. I work at Dickinson College. I've been here 14 years. So I was very much involved in the third assessment report of the IPCC, which came out in 2001. And at the very end of that process, there was a lot of conversation amongst the author team about the relative dearth of information, published research about how people in the global south are being affected by climate change and hazards and will be affected by climate change and hazards. And then related to that, looking across the author team of the low representation of people from the global south. And also I would add female authors as well. So I became involved then in funding was sought from the Global Environment Facility for a project that I ended up being hired for later to direct that was intended to develop, provide resources and develop capacity amongst various kinds of researchers, stakeholders, experts in the global south to become involved in global change research, and particularly climate change research and looking at adaptation and vulnerability. That's one, I think I may have met Lisa before that, but in the process of that project, she and I worked a bit together on that. Fatima also was doing similar work with ENDA, and we collaborated a bit on that. So that was a context in which I was like looking at initially the equity issues in terms of equity of what do we know about different parts of the world and why do we not know enough about some parts of the world and who's participating in writing these reports. And then more recently, so I came to Dickinson 14 years ago. After I was here for a few years, I started teaching a course on sustainable and resilient communities. And the first time I offered that course, I used a textbook that was good, but I also realized after, the first time through the course, it was a very sterile, sort of antiseptic view of sustainable communities in which it was kind of like, all we need to do is learn what the right answers are. We need to just learn how do we do things more sustainably, mostly from an environmental perspective. And people will learn about that, agree on that, and we'll all be simpatico and things will go fine. And understanding I know that's not how the world actually works. And at that point, there was also a good deal of, I think it was maybe police violence in Ferguson and St. Louis at that time, and looking at issues of racism, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, and thinking those are all part of what needs to be part of thinking about how do we create sustainable communities. And so I completely just blew up the course and changed it and included readings about issues of racial justice, other aspects of equity, and that became part of my teaching, and that's been a very rewarding pathway that I've been on. I have a couple of my students in this room who I think would probably say, yes, Neil, that was a good direction to go in, and you're not done traveling that path. All right, so now we're going to have, I think Ben's going to go first here. He's going to present, give us a little bit of an entryway into these issues of just transitions. And I think we've got some slides.
Yeah, so I have one slide somewhere, which will appear. And as that's coming up, I think it's interesting. We've heard a lot about transitions and more recently transformations over the course of the 3 days. And sometimes this has been very, very explicit, and sometimes it's been a little bit indirect. But, Deborah introduced us to this concept of climate resilient development in her keynote. And she talked explicitly about some of the big sort of system transitions that are necessary. And this includes, of course, transitions in energy systems, but also transitions in societal systems in terms of consumption patterns, behavior preferences, or as you've heard today, even how we think about educational systems. So myself and Lisa and Steve Rose, who you've heard from on Monday, we're part of the author team in the AR6 for Working Group 2 that wrestled with this concept of climate resilient development, and I would say wrestled figuratively and almost literally at times, to try and articulate, what this concept means for other people. But, essentially these sort of transitions are really necessary for where we think we want to go in terms of a policy perspective. But the important thing to remember is that and this came up, I think, in the last conversation, these things are disruptive. And they are disruptive by design, right? They're intended to disrupt the status quo, to facilitate change, but they're also disrupted by accidents, or accidents happen along the way, and there's sort of unintended consequences. In that context, I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I see as sort of different dimensions that sort of need to keep in mind as you think about just transitions, and hopefully that will set up Lisa and Fatima to dig a little bit deeper in their remarks. So identified sort of 4 different things we need to think about when it comes to just transition. So one is, we have to, independent of climate change, focus on improving human and ecological well-being in the pursuit of sustainable development. I think as Deborah mentioned in her remarks, yes, we need to address climate change, but a lot of people are dealing with a lot of other things other than climate change. We're dealing with poverty, marginalization, displacement, migration, refugees, education, healthcare, so on and so forth. And we have to continue to lift people up even as we address the climate change challenge. That's almost first and foremost. Second, we have to think about the consequences of climate change and global change more broadly, and move toward trying to think more equitably about how those consequences are distributed. We've already had significant human impacts on the global Earth system. Those are already contributing to vulnerability, loss, and damage today. That's going to continue in the future. It's horribly inequitable, and unless we get serious about this, it's going to continue to be horribly inequitable. And that has been, I think, a key focus of particularly the climate justice movement, is calling out the fact that sort of the impacts of climate change are going to be distributed inequitably around the world, and it's going to impact the more vulnerable disproportionately. There's a couple of other dimensions that I like to focus on. So one is, as we try and address this climate crisis and think about interventions, whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or trying to adapt to become more resilient, those interventions can in and of themselves enhance vulnerability and undermine well-being. So in the adaptation realm, we call this maladaptation. But there's a range of other externalities that could result. Lisa's written a lot about this and might elaborate. But if we are addressing climate change, but at the same time we're driving up the cost for energy, for water, for food, for vulnerable populations, that is a problem. If we are forcing people out of their homes and their communities, that is a problem. If we're taking people away from their cultures, that is a problem. Those are impacts, not solutions, and we have to figure out how to address that. And then lastly, the thing I'm particularly interested in at the moment is when we think about the benefits of interventions and the benefits of transitions in particular, how are those benefits distributed equitably? So what do I mean by that? Well, as we heard, I think yesterday, the day before, a lot of the interventions that we're seeing right now from the U.S. federal government are carrots, right? So particularly in the form of grants and tax credits. So who's getting those carrots, right? Tends to be those who can take advantage of tax credits. It tends to be those who are getting grants to do things in the name of climate resilience. Renewable energy corporations and firms, they're the ones that are going to receive that. Obviously, the administration has also prioritized job creation and making sure these benefits are shared more broadly. But I think we have to track that very, very carefully and make sure that when it comes to subsidies and tax credits and job creation, that those are also being distributed equally and also are flowing to those that are most disadvantaged and most vulnerable. So I'll stop there. That's lots to think about, and hand it over to others to dig deeper.
All right. Thank you, Ben. And as Lisa gets ready to get started here, just remind the audience here to be thinking about questions to ask. So we've just heard from Ben, so scribble down a question driven by something you heard from Ben, so you're ready later. Lisa, go ahead.
Sorry, I am just finding technology. There we go. Okay, I hope you can see that now.
Yes, we're seeing it.
Great. Just need to make sure I also have my notes in front of me. Sorry. Sorry, I just need my notes in front of me also. Gosh, why can't it just cooperate? Okay, there we go. Good. Sorry about that. So, right, yeah, what I wanted to highlight today was really just to zoom in on one dimension of, I think, what is this bigger picture that just Ben painted of just transitions, and that is particularly gender. It's something that I've worked on a lot. I know Fatima also has worked on this a lot, but it's particularly, I think, important because it tends to get, ironically, it tends to get marginalized. And that's exactly why we need to look at gender, because we're talking about marginalized groups. So I should say that we had in chapter 18 on climate resilient development pathways in working group 2, we also had a cross-chapter box on gender, which included some authors also from outside working group 2, which was fantastic. And I want to point out that here, this presentation is just drawing on the collective wisdom of colleagues, including my co-chairs, Deborah, sitting in the audience. And I obviously don't want to take any individual credit for this, but at the same time, I should probably say the caveat that what I'm presenting is, I've made the decision about what to emphasize. So I think that what is really fantastic about the AR6 report is that it's different from previous reports in that it centers around these concepts of equity and justice, and it identifies a huge amount. For instance, as Ben talked about, these adaptation strategies, which many of them are not effective, and many aren't addressing the needs of the most socially marginalized, including women. So what we find is that adaptation solutions that are effective and feasible conform to these principles of justice. And what's more, equity and justice is a fundamental component of climate resilient development, which I assume you've now already heard from Deborah. And climate resilient development is this process of strategically and purposely combining adaptation and mitigation to support sustainable development. And in our summary for policymakers, we emphasize that opportunities for climate resilient development are not equitably distributed around the world. And we have very high confidence about this, nor are they equitably distributed among different groups. And so the report uses this concept of climate justice to highlight these different communities and talk about the unequal distribution of climate change impacts and opportunities for adaptation and mitigation, and calls for these transformative pathways for human and ecological well-being. Also, we should note that the Working Group 3 report talks about gender, not quite as much as Working Group 2, but talks about gender-specific policies that promote equitable outcomes, that these are actually core elements of a just transition. I want to point out that everything from Working Group 3, I have had the advantage of Minal Patak from the Technical Support Unit, who has helped give me this information. And so it's basically on the basis of this that I want to talk about just transitions as gender. So a gender perspective doesn't center on women or men, but it examines structures and processes and relationships of power between and among groups of men and women, and how gender, particularly in this non-binary form, intersects with other social categories such as race, class, socioeconomic status, nationality, or education to create multidimensional inequalities. And so essentially this gender transformative approach aims to change structural inequities. And gender has had a central role in development agendas for a long time, and it's essentially now moved out of the periphery of climate change. And the context is slightly different now, though, because now we're not just bringing women into climate change policy and planning as sort of part of an approach to include the most marginalized, but we're actually recognizing that women are agents of change. And so if climate resilient development pathways, or climate resilient development, is only possible when equity and justice are part of the picture, that means that we really need to think about women and gender issues as well. So we have actually come really far since AR5, and we have identified a lot more integrated knowledge on gender. We understand, of course, that it's not just sort of climate that is driving the problems, but we see how there's sort of economic inequity, inequitable access to water, healthcare, food, and nature, and how these things all combine and create this essentially this crisis. And so that is because climate change is a multiplier of all other societal challenges. And we've definitely seen these kinds of things exacerbated through the COVID-19 pandemic. So just to be clear, women still bear the brunt of difficult times, have unequal control over resources. Fatima just gave a good example of when projects, and this was from a while ago, I recognize that I think these are probably very similar issues still. And they're very specific things as well around gender issues. For instance, when there's a lot of problem accessing drinking water or bad infrastructure for drinking water, it's mainly the women and girls who walk long distances to access water. And this creates huge amounts of problems. It limits their time available for other things like education, but it also, of course, can expose them to various kinds of violence and other problems. So these are the kinds of things that we see in the context. And as climate change comes and creates these sort of weather impacts, and we see how people are actually, how women are actually bearing the brunt of this. And in working through it, it's interesting because they also identify that women have lower carbon footprints, and for instance, that carbon emissions are lower per capita in countries where women have more political voice. This is taking a lot of other factors into account as well, but women use less energy, have lower greenhouse gas emissions, and also have more sustainable consumption choices. So there are actually, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, you can see that there are some really important gender issues to consider. So actually, Ben nicely talked about sort of what is the sort of that we're now looking at climate justice and how important this has become. And that has translated into this being much more of a feature in the IPCC reports. I think it's natural because the literature is reflecting how climate justice really matters. And so we're seeing this much more of an increased focus on social justice and a use of recognition of intersectionality of issues around sort of gender, race, class, all sorts of things that matter. And particularly the role of power and participation in implementing climate action. So what we see is, of course, as I just said, this lack of limited participation in various activities is a major gender issue. Women are often left out of making important decisions about resources in a household or community. We also see sort of multiple forms of inequality. So as I talked about, these multiple things, gender, race, income, and the historical inequities and injustices, because every country in the world still has huge gender inequalities. We see migration, which exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities, inequities in access to basic services and other things. And interestingly, actions to address climate change can also have trade-offs for equity and justice. So poorly planned, implemented nature-based solutions, for example, in agriculture intensification and urban greening projects, can lead to climate injustice through, for example, climate gentrification. And also when projects determine that land ownership is a criteria for participation in adaptation projects, this can exclude women in places where women are not allowed to own land. So coming to the end, I think it's important to recognize that there are solutions, and we actually have a huge amount of knowledge on this, thanks to the now very many, I would say many decades of research on gender and development and gender and environment issues. And these include things like insurance, equitable access to finance, climate finance, social protection, and gender transformative policies, and solutions that really need to adequately address structural inequalities. It can't just address sort of the surface impacts of climate change. It has to go deeper than that and look at why, sort of what is the vulnerability, what's driving people's vulnerability to climate change. And so very specific things like investment in appropriate water supplies and storage techniques and climate-proofed water and sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, for example. So in our punchline in Working Group 2, we talk about the rapidly closing window of opportunity. And the reality is that the extent to which we can keep this brief, rapidly closing window of opportunity open is not only dependent on technology and finance, but also on the extent to which development trajectories are shaped by considerations of equity and social and climate justice. And if you're interested in looking specifically at gender, in Working Group 2, there are a number of chapters that talk a lot about gender. I mentioned Chapter 18 and the cross-chapter box on gender, but also Working Group 3, Chapters 4, 5, and 17. So there are good places to look. And with that, I just want to say thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. So again, people in the audience here, be thinking about questions, make some notes. People watching virtually, you can type questions in the chat at any time. I'm not seeing anything in there yet, so you don't have to wait till the end. Fatima, go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot, Neil and Lisa and Ben. I think my point is just perhaps going to complement what has been said already. One observation that I have working in Africa is that these concepts basically are defined elsewhere. They're not shaped by social actors in this part of the world. And that's already a power dynamic there. Most of the policymakers that I talk to have a sense that, yes, there's an equity issue and they talk about it, but the conceptualization, I'd say, of just transition, who defines that, who shapes it, and who benefits from it as well. So I think these are real issues, because on the one hand, we're saying that climate change is a consequence of, basically our consumption patterns, but consumption patterns that means that people are in the front line and are experiencing the negative externalities of climate impacts. But even as they experience these negative externalities, they're not able to define the orientation that they'd like to take, either as a safety net or as a way of getting out of this. So that sort of definitional deficit, I think, is the first thing to recognize, that this is about power. And I think Lisa's mentioned that. It's about structures and the powers within those structures. But there are huge asymmetrical relationships that we can't ignore. These are the elephants in the room, and we have to be able to talk about it. So that's the first point I'll make. I can't remember who it is, but it's a famous quote whereby the person mentioned that the transition itself is inevitable, but justice isn't, and that is so true. And I often say that in as much as we want green transition and we all want to move away from fossil fuels, it cannot be. We cannot race to get to the green pathway sort of destination, to the point whereby we sacrifice justice for green. So green cannot become, if you like, the enemy of what is just. I think beyond that, I'd say we need to really make efforts about how we democratize it and how we make it more inclusive. Because right now, I would say the problem's being defined in one part of the world, and those that are really feeling the brunt are not able to be part of that definition. So there is a huge power structure and vacuum and deficit in terms of, those that sit around a table and get to be part of that definition. I think we should also be talking about transitions in the plural and not in the singular, because, as I said, there are several transitions. There are societies that have been on that transition ladder for a long time and haven't been able to really move very far. So what transitions are we talking about, and how do we recognize when it does happen? we have been talking about stranded assets as an example of just transitions, and I personally would think we need to move away from looking at just transition within that narrow definition of jobs. I think it's more than jobs. There's a tendency to just, focus on the job loss. And we are seeing in Africa, for instance, that with countries that are very much dependent on fossil fuel, that there is a loss in terms of fiscal revenue. There are losses in terms of strategic objectives like education, like health, because a lot of the revenue that countries like Ghana get, Nigeria, Mozambique, Angola, were also plowed back into strategic sectors like health, like education. In Ghana, for instance, a lot of the monies that are made out of oil revenue goes into supporting free high school education. And that's going to have to stop someday soon, I think, given what's happening and the multiple storms and turbulence that we're witnessing. So those are real problems. We're also saying that there is a real fear that in as much as we are working towards just transitions, that there is a sense that developed nations are discounting some very important transitional levers. They're discounting the fact that time is important, that countries in Africa are not just going to be able to overnight move to a cleaner trajectory. So the time dimension, I think, needs to be thought through very carefully. There's also an issue of capacity. The infrastructure that would enable a just transition, the technology that would enable a just transition, the financial resources that would enable a just transition are not in place for many countries in Africa. And so therefore, from that sort of capacity dimension, we need to also bear in mind that this is not going to happen overnight. I've also talked about the inclusion dimension. Just transition is something that's going to affect men and women. In South Africa and some other countries, we're seeing that with the closure of mines, this is also having an impact on the ancillary businesses that are centered around those mines. And very often these businesses are controlled and owned by women. And the insecurity that comes with closing mines also, when it becomes a no-go area and prone to gang war and culture, those insecurities are also felt by women. So those things are not discussed. In Nigeria, where women are also very keen to use natural gas as a source for food processing, are realizing that if these things were now left in the ground, they might have to look for other sources of income, because the flaring of gas is used to do quite a lot of things with foods, drying fish and smoking fish. And that's a good source of income for women. So that, again, is something that we need to bear in mind. And then there's also an issue of scope, if you're talking about, how do you actually, where do you actually start? Do you start from a national level? Do you start from a regional level? If you take Africa, there are a number of countries that are rich in natural resources, but also very rich in oil and gas resources. And at the regional level, there is no strategy, at least to my knowledge, in terms of how to deal with these issues. So countries will have to negotiate individually. In fact, that's already happening. If you look at the European Green Deal, for instance, the Green Deal has some kind of carbon tax, whereby countries that are exporting to the EU may be faced with a tax because of the fact that if their products are coming from carbon-intensive industries, then they get slapped with a tax, and that is borne by countries that are, to some extent, sharing a mitigation burden that they didn't create. And most of these countries do not have they don't have the heavy industry, so they're losing out. I mean, in the case of Mozambique, I think I had the figure somewhere that if you look at Mozambique exports aluminium and iron to the EU, and there is a sense that they will be losing at least 1% of their GDP as a result of this tax. So those are direct consequences of a transition that is being oriented and directed, and the shots have been called from somewhere else. And then the last point I'd like to make, because there's a lot to say about just transition, is the informal sector, which is an important sector in this part of the world. It contributes to jobs, a huge portion of jobs. 90%, I would say, the informal sector makes up of 90% of the private sector and creates more than 50% of employment. And so the informal sector are often ignored in what a just transition would look like. We have a project where we're deliberately looking at what is the role of the informal sector. How do you bring informal sector into green businesses, right? And how do you support them in understanding the business development side of green businesses, so that they can scale out and have these potential markets. What is the social protection? What's the labor regulation that are provided to informal sector? These are things that are, are somewhat dismissed and ignored to a large extent. And we are of the view that if the informal sector, given the wide range of skills and services they provide, from fruit vendors to people who are in the welding business to people who are in the brewing business, if they were brought into the fold of what green businesses could look like, they could be a litmus test for just transition. They could lead on what a green development and green pathway could look like. So it is a safe space to basically support green solutions. But at the moment, the informal sector do not seem to be taken into account in just transitions and how this can be shaped. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to mention, but I'd say that the debate has been evolved and been monitored very much from the parts that need it the most. And I think that this is a fundamental power structure and power situation. And I think Lisa mentioned this as well. And it really has a lot to do with climate action. I think just transition for me and climate action or climate justice are surrogates. They're very much part of the same thing. You can't solve one without solving the other. And so there are so many layers of just transition. But much of it stems from the struggle that we have already with climate justice. The fact that the impacts of climate change are experienced differently. They're experienced differently from different social actors, different groups, and these impacts are generations of structural difficulties and challenges that we just sort of, superimposing one injustice after another: energy, climate change, poverty, and these are all structural problems. And as long as these are not solved and addressed, just transition would be a pipe dream. It looks like a pipe dream from where I sit. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Fatima. So now we're going to take some questions from the audience. As an undergraduate institution, we'll give preference initially here to questions from students. Raise your hand if you have a question. We have one down over here.
First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us today. My question is directed towards Fatima's points. You mentioned how important the informal sector is to the economy and jobs of African communities, and I was wondering what that transformation would look like in regards to getting on that green path. Would this be something that other countries can support, like the U.S., and if so, what would that support look like?
Okay. So let's see if there's another one or two more questions in the room. Let's get those on the table, and then we'll respond. Are there other questions in the room?
Thank you. My question is, to what extent do you think the status of women can improve and that we can achieve gender equity using the humanities? I'm thinking in particular of stories about transition. I'm thinking about visions such as solar punk, Afrofuturism, the climate literature movement, and science fiction. Thank you.
All right. Seeing other questions just now, so why don't we go ahead and get started. The first question, I think, Fatima, was specifically addressed to you, but so you go first, and then we'll see if either Lisa or Ben would like to also respond.
Okay, so thanks for that question. I think the first thing to say is that there are some of the traditional solutions that are here, like off-grid solutions, off-grid energy solutions, that can be scaled up to a large extent for informal sector. So I think the penetration of renewable energy hasn't actually happened in the way that one expects, even in countries that are home to huge endowments, I'd say, in renewable energy. So I think penetration and scale and how you deploy it, issues around battery, some of those barriers that we see with renewable energy, even if the prices are coming down, need to be addressed. And maybe that's where solidarity, I think, would matter, where other countries like the US and I would say richer nations probably need to see how best to support African countries in that scaling up. So that's one. Second one, I would say, we are talking about a fourth industrial revolution. And there is a sense that some of the green minerals are going to be hugely critical to the scaling up of these renewable energies. We're going to need more cobalt. We're going to need more aluminium. We're going to need more copper. Many of these are resources that are home to Africa. And I think that the informal sector would have a role to play in how these could be scaled up. But again, you know, there are initial investment costs to scaling up. And here again, informal sector would need some support in doing this. And I think on that same note, in as much as we're talking about new sources of energy like hydrogen, you know, and we're discussing how we could deploy this at a scale that matters, a transformational scale. Again, you know, we could also use the informal sector to see how, you know, they could begin to understand what is at stake, but also begin to see how they can be supported. And to a large extent, I'll say some of the safety nets as well are not there, as I mentioned. It's not just the business opportunities, but it's also looking at potential safety nets that would come from the deployment of these new sources of energy. So how do we create those safety nets? So I think the solutions are there, but also something we don't talk about a lot is that it also needs leadership. You know, I mean, governance and leadership are never too far away from all of this. So it needs bold leadership, and it needs leadership at that sort of global level, but also at the local and national and even subnational level. So those are, I guess, potential opportunities. And I haven't even mentioned potential opportunities that are within the circular economy. You know, there are a lot of opportunities in the circular economy where we could keep goods in circularity for much longer. So how we do that and how we bring the informal sector, especially in the waste sector, I think would be crucial. So the opportunities are there, but we need to have the political will and the courage to really find the leverage points, I'd say, to bring solutions to the table, and that's what we haven't been able to do.
Okay, so Lisa and Ben, do either of you want to take add to a response about informal communities, or would you want to address this question about the role of humanities and storytelling and solar punk as an aspect of how we make progress on gender issues? So either of those questions, do you want to jump in on?
Lisa, you want to go first?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to address the question of humanities. I think that's a fantastic question because it is actually also tends to get marginalized when we think about climate research. And in fact, there's a huge amount of knowledge in the humanities that we can draw on. I think, for example, just recently I've been seeing how across the kind of, especially geography and other social sciences, have been really impacted by Amitav Ghosh's book, The Nutmeg's Curse, which talks specifically links colonialism and climate change. And I think, that's just, it's not a scientific book. It does have good references in it, but it's a book for normal people. And so, I think we can really, look across literature. History, of course, is another hugely important discipline. But I would say, in terms of gender, I think this is exactly what it is. It's about the narrative, the framing, the way that we're talking about the problem. So what is actually the issue, and how do we portray it so that people really understand that we're kind of coming to these root causes of what drives vulnerability to climate change. What does it mean when we talk about gender issues? And I think that there isn't really a good way in our kind of more academic, sort of, especially social sciences, we tend to get lost in these huge words. But somehow there are all these other channels, and particularly closely connected to the humanities, that can offer that. Music, for instance, is a very rich discipline to allow us to explore these issues. And I think that is necessary, totally needed. In fact, we have a project at Oxford that talks about sort of social sciences and humanities and how it can contribute to thinking about the climate crisis. And that's sort of, but I think it's really critical.
So as a natural scientist, I'll make the mistake of commenting on the humanities. But you're brave. Yeah, I know. I think where the humanities, for me, really fit in is creating a vision or narrative of what the future could look like, what these opportunities look like in practice, right? Like, I grew up reading a lot of science fiction, right, which are very good at sort of world building and trying to create an image to help people visualize what the future could be, right? And, the science fiction of 30, 40, 50 years ago got a lot of stuff wrong. We got some stuff right. And I think what we're often missing, and where we see a lot of sort of social rejection of some of these transformations, is people cannot see themselves in that future, right? How are my children going to live? How am I going to live? What work am I going to do? What's my house going to look like? And uncertainty creates fear and therefore leads to rejection. And so, being able to create visions for people for, this is what a net zero future looks like. This is what your day-to-day life looks like. This is what you're going to be eating. This is what your relationships are like, I think can help maybe scare people more or create more of a help soothe people a little bit. The other thing I'll point out, this is just as a current event. So the U.S. 5th National Climate Assessment is being drafted right now. There is an open call right now as we speak for submissions of art to the 5th National Climate Assessment. Pretty sure this is the first time this has been done. May not be done again. I don't know. But it's really opening up what we think of as a scientific assessment to much broader forms of contribution and knowledge. And the last thing I would say, just on this, back to this issue of informality, is just sort of, particularly for students in the room, we've heard a lot about informal settlements and economies this week, but those exist here in the United States as well. And because of the size of the U.S. economy, the informal economy here is quite large. when it comes to dollar values. So just tuck that away in the back of your mind. Thanks.
Thank you. So we've got some questions from our virtual audience, and so I'll pose, I think we'll have time to take two of them. So I'll read out two of these questions and then see who would like to respond to these. The first one is about climate finance. So the Green Climate Fund, designed to address issues of equity, but developed countries have failed to provide the amount of funds they made commitments for, $100 billion per year. So they've fallen short on that. The process also, this is a question from Vlad about the process is one that's very political, it's ineffective, making it hard to access those funds. So think about a response to that question and who might want to answer that one. And then Shane has a question about how does a young person get involved in the inequity of climate change knowledge globally? I think maybe sort of what are the roles by which young people can be actively participating in addressing in a very positive way inequities, injustice surrounding climate and gender and other issues. Who would like to take either of those questions to start with? I saw you, Lisa. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, so much silence and the time is ticking. I guess I would say, maybe starting from the final question, the second question about getting involved, I think there's a huge, we just talked about humanities and the role it can play, various disciplines and sort of can play in opening our minds. I think that's the key issue around climate justice, and it's essentially, it's an extension of environmental justice, it's an extension of racial justice, extension of gender justice. It is essentially, an ability to bring together all these different issues. And if you can carry that with you, and if you can help people understand how that works, that, I would say, is an incredibly important mechanism for engaging in climate justice, because you have to remember that even though we might understand what these issues are, so many people don't really understand that. And so being able to communicate that well and clearly, and also to bring together these different communities that are working essentially on the same issues, just with kind of different focus, different foci. I think that is one way to involve. It sounds a bit abstract, but I hope that makes sense. And then in terms of the financing, I think this is a huge question. It is incredibly, it is really about power issues, and this is Fatima was referring to. It is about the structures, the way that the fund is set up, the way who decides, who's sitting on the boards, who's sitting in the, who's actually putting the money in, and how they get the power to make decisions about projects. And then the actors, the intermediate actors who come in and who are supposed to help different countries in the global south prepare these project reports, project proposals. And the way that they also take a chunk of this funding, and they also have their way of influencing the process. So it is inherently inequitable the way it's set up. But that's one thing. The other thing is the fact that there's never going to be enough money to address all of the issues. And this kind of linking back just finally to the climate justice issue, if we really wanted to address the vulnerability to climate change, then we would have to, it wouldn't be sufficient just to do these kinds of green climate fund projects. We would have to look much, much deeper.
Fatima or Ben, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that point about looking much deeper, I'd say that we also need more alternatives around this 100 billion, because some of us have had this 100 billion for a long time, and we're nowhere closer to getting there. So I think we need other alternatives, and we need other alternatives on how we solve the problem as well, because we need to probably think about smaller groups, regional blocks. We don't have to take it doesn't mean that we're going to do away with the UNFCCC process, but I think we need smaller groups with people that have similar types of problems. Where the negotiation is not so adversarial to a large extent, and they can find ways of working around these big issues. But I'd also like to say that the obstacles to climate finance are also obstacles to just transitions. Again, these two things are related. As long as we are not able to find the monies for climate finance, we're exacerbating injustice. And people in the front line will continue to pay the price. And I know that when we want to find monies for some things that are seemingly important, we do find monies. I mean, the COVID pandemic was a very good example. How we're able to raise monies, in no time. So monies are there, monies can be found, but I think the big problem is a political economy problem, and that will take a long time to fix. Okay. But countries do need to realize that bold leadership again matters, thoughtful leadership matters, governance matters. These are all part of the same jigsaw puzzle. The climate finance is a stubborn issue, and it's going to be there for a long time because we simply haven't found creative ways of addressing it. And that's what it needs. It needs innovative, creative ways of addressing this problem. And ultimately, if we don't, then it says something about environmental stewardship. Because the fundamental part of the problem is a problem of resources. And that is going to linger on for a long, long time to come. And that's why I believe that we need to find alternative ways of negotiating this. Because the UN FCCC process with over 190 countries is way too big. So we can keep that for the COP. But in between the COP sections, we need to find smaller groups. The EU might want to sit with Africa and negotiate. African countries might want to sit together. And even there, it's big. They might want to sit together from a regional perspective, the North Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, etc. But I think we need smaller groups so that at least the process is not too unwieldy.
Okay, thank you for that, Fatima. So we are at time, but I do want to give Ben a chance if you have something you want to say in response to these questions that are on the table.
Yeah, I won't offer any specific solutions because that would be too easy. But in terms of particularly for, young people who are getting into this space and thinking about it, I think, being able to think clearly and critically about what's going on, it's more of a sort of skill set you need to develop and bring to the table. So, in any of these situations, asking yourself who benefits from the situation and how are they benefiting, who's losing from the situation and how are they losing. I think that helps sort of cultivate sort of an approach to critical thinking that then reveals these inequities because they're all around us. And you've heard a multitude of examples in a very short amount of time. And I think sometimes these are surprising for folks, but if you train yourself to look for them, they're sort of all around us. And I think particularly for young people, students who are coming up, like developing that skill set to be able to look quite critically at a situation and question the sort of status quo and the circumstances is a powerful tool that will serve you well in the future.
Yeah, so one opportunity that I think can be accessible for young people is when there's a process going on for creating a local climate action plan, whether it's for your city or a state level one. A really interesting trend over the last few years is that climate action plans that have been developed by cities or states in the United States have started to use the language of climate justice, climate equity. Virginia, I think, is one that has a good example where they have very much put climate equity very much at the center of what they're doing. Others have not, and I won't sort of name names, but I've watched processes in which issues of climate equity and justice were raised, and they were kind of politely kind of pushed aside as, well, that's going to be divisive, that's going to be problematic. Maybe this is kind of echoing something that Fatima said of we don't want to be sacrificing justice in the name of green. So I've seen at the local scale where maybe sacrificing is too strong a word, but they want to kind of slide it aside and say that can come as we do this kind of below the scenes. So my point here is these are often conversations you as a young person can get access to and be part of and let your voice be heard about should climate equity and justice be part of those local climate action plans? And if so, how? And then don't forget that after these plans are adopted, they need to be implemented. And how they're implemented, they might have some wonderful language in there about climate justice, but if they're not being watched, if you're not participating in that implementation, things can go a different track. So that would be one area in which to think about. Thank you very much to our panelists. This has been a very good conversation. For our next panel, we're going to have Fatima back again. So Fatima, don't sign off when we close this. I want to chat with you just a second before we come back. So please join me in thanking our panelists. So at 4:30 is when our next and last session will begin. It will be focusing on issues of climate policy and action, thinking about it from local to global scales. We will have a keynote talk from Co Barrett, Vice Chair of the IPCC, and then we will have a panel discussion in which Co will participate, and Fatima and a couple of other guests will be part of that as well. So I hope you'll join us for that. And Fatima, if you could just kind of hang on 2 minutes and I'll be right with you.